Okay, so it's 8:30. So tēnā koutou katoa. A very big welcome to you all from ISCAST and New Zealand Christians in Science. We're very pleased tonight to have Dr. Joshua Wilson-Black speak to us. He has degrees in mathematics, data science, and philosophy, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Sheffield. And in that dissertation, he applied the thought of Charles Peirce to debates in contemporary philosophy. He's a lecturer at the New Zealand Institute of Language, Brain and Behaviour at the University of Canterbury, where he teaches statistical and computational methods and pursues research at the intersection of data science, linguistics and philosophy. He's an Anglican layperson at home, he says, in the Anglo-Catholic tradition. So let me just begin with a prayer, which is based on the collect, Anglican collect for Thursday. Christ, be within us in this meeting to keep us, beside us in our thoughts to guard, before us in our listening to lead, behind us in our wanderings to protect, and beneath us in our questions to support, and above all, us all to bless. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you. All right. Let's do some screen sharing. Okay, you should see the main slide then. Okay, so tuhia ki te rangi, tuhia ki te whenua, tuhia ki te ngākau o ngā tāngata, ko te mea nui, ko te aroha, tihei muriora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everyone, and a happy Feast of the Ascension to you. Thanks very much to ISCAST and NZCIS for inviting me to speak to you. So I just opened with a tauparapara, the meaning of which is write it on the heavens, write it on the land, write it on the hearts of the people. The greatest thing is love. And it's the connection between love and science, sort of in conversation with the work of Charles Peirce, that's my topic tonight, I should say. So a quick overview of what I'm going to be speaking about. I'm going to start by answering some who questions. So the first is, I'll tell you something about Charles Peirce. I won't assume you know anything about him in advance. And I will say a little bit about myself as well, which I think is useful in this kind of presentation. Then I'm going to talk about 4 ways in which love and inquiry intersect in Peirce's thought. So first, the importance of the love of reality for a certain kind of science, then the love of inquiry, and in particular, the community engaged in inquiry. Then whether it is appropriate in science to love our ideas, Peirce thinks it is, and that that's part of what enables them to grow. And then finally, love is a kind of power or agency. So that's the point where we'll really get at what Peirce means when he's means by love, when he's talking about love. Then I'm going to conclude with saying something about the kind of affective and intellectual package of theism and science that Peirce finds sort of so appealing, and a little bit about why, on Peirce's view, many scientists who think they're atheists are really a kind of sort of confused theist. A little note here, I noticed when I practiced this that I'm using the word affective a lot. I mean, affective to do with affect, emotions, feelings, but in a New Zealand accent, this is very dangerous because it sounds basically the same as effective. So just to let you know, if it sounds like I'm saying effective, I'm saying affective. And now that I've said that, probably I'll go off script and say effective, but affective is what we're aiming for typically. So these who questions. So Charles Peirce, his career spans kind of the second half of the 19th century and the first decade or so of the 20th. The first problem here is pronunciation again. You read his name and you think Peirce, it's Peirce. I wish it weren't that way. It would be much easier if it was Peirce, but it's Peirce. His work spanned a huge range of disciplines, and he preferred to call himself a logician, so someone who studies reasoning, argumentation, inference. But he was many things in addition to that. He was the son of a Harvard mathematician and physicist called Benjamin Peirce. His family were like many of the kind of Harvard sort of elite at that time Unitarians. But Peirce himself becomes a Trinitarian in his 20s, and indeed an Episcopalian. And then much later in his life, he has quite a strong religious experience during a Eucharistic service at St. Thomas Fifth Avenue in New York, if any of you know that church. And after that, religion again becomes a really important sort of aspect of his thought. So there's a great book by Roger Ward that came out recently called Peirce and Religion that I'd encourage people to look at. He had many, many scientific contributions. I'll just mention he's, I think, the first person in the States to do a randomized design in psychology. They used just a deck of playing cards to randomize the order in which certain stimuli were given to them. And he also made his money for a while doing measurements of the strength of gravity using sort of pendulum kind of apparati, I suppose, apparatuses, whatever you like, including some really advanced methods at the time for dealing with error introduced by the flexion of kind of the mechanism. But he struggled to find stable academic employment, and towards the end of his life, he's sort of struggling to keep the heating on in his house, and he and his wife are sort of struggling there and being supported by various of his friends, notably William James, who you may have heard of. And when he dies, he leaves behind many, many manuscripts, which then come into the hands of Harvard. And I've actually used a lot of those in the presentation. So you see this background as a sort of a labyrinth that he drew in one of these manuscripts. So I take it that Peirce is a particularly useful conversation partner given his range across issues relevant to religion, science, and philosophy. I wanted to highlight one particular idea of his that I think helps sort of set the general stage for what he's up to in philosophy. So you may have heard of the term pragmatism as a movement in philosophy, and usually that's attributed to Peirce. And for Peirce, what this is the attempt to articulate kind of the intellectual orientation of the experimental scientist as part of philosophy. So he opens a late statement of what pragmatism is in this way. So the writer of this article has been led by much experience to believe that every physicist and every chemist, and in short, every master in any department of experimental science has had his mind molded by the life in the laboratory to a degree that is little suspected. Peirce, once you notice this, it's just he, him, himself everywhere. Obviously, it's a product of the time. So hopefully you'll forgive that. But what he goes on, so he's attempting to articulate the orientation of the laboratory scientist, and he goes on to distinguish this from an orientation he associates with the seminary. So for Peirce, the seminary orientation is directed towards reading rather than towards experiment. And so it's kind of unsurprising that often you're going to see pragmatism be taken to be a kind of essentially anti-religious orientation. It rejects the seminary in favor of the laboratory. And Peirce is often read this way. However, that is a mistake. In fact, Peirce thought that atheism was most common amongst people who read books about science rather than people who participate in it. So you can, in fact, be a seminary scientific atheist. It's not a religion versus science distinction. And I take it that the root of that error is to miss the distinction between starting philosophy with the results of experimental sciences or the results of science in general versus starting your philosophy with a description of what it is to engage in science as a practice. And Peirce is doing the latter thing. So that's a little bit about what pragmatism is. A little bit about me quickly. You heard a little bit in the introduction. So my kind of religious history, if that's of interest to you to see where I might be coming from. I started in a kind of open brethren community in Christchurch. That's where I was raised. There were plenty of very scientifically engaged people in that congregation. I went full Dawkins as a teen and in my early 20s, and then somehow ended up as an Anglo-Catholic sort of in my mid to late 20s. So a bit of a shift in the style of Christianity, but a return to Christianity nonetheless. Academically, my background's philosophy and mathematics, and part of that was a heavy dose of the history and philosophy of science. At which time I got very interested in Peirce and went on to pursue that study with a MA in Waikato and a PhD at Sheffield in the UK. And it's sort of in the course of that kind of academic development that I came to see that the particular version, the picture of science that I had as a teenage atheist was a very oversimplified kind of picture. After the PhD, I had a slightly weird path. I had a kind of monastic interlude. So I spent 18 months in a kind of new monastic community in Wales. The monastic vocation didn't kind of stick, but that was a really important time for sort of deepening my faith and practice. So returned to New Zealand, I retrained as a data scientist, and then got involved in quite data and stats heavy aspects of linguistics. First as a postdoc after finishing this master's, which is a slightly odd thing, and now as a lecturer in the New Zealand Institute for Language, Brain and Behaviour. So working on very kind of stats heavy aspects of linguistics. So I also have this kind of experience across science, religion and philosophy. And that I think is part of why I still find Peirce really, really kind of appealing as a subject. So let's go on to these 4 ideas from Peirce that I want to put before you and sort of see what you think about them. So I want to introduce the first one, the love of reality, with what you might describe uncharitably as a kind of stale rant from 10 years ago. Some of you will recognize this logo. This is the logo of a Facebook group that started in 2012 and was very, very popular. Actually also started by someone from Sheffield. So the L stands for love, the I stands for I, and the F you can figure out for yourself. What was the problem with this page, insofar as I thought this at the time? Well, this is the kind of stuff that they would publish. Beautiful. The Secret Life of Snails. So this is a series of kind of photographs by a photographer called Vyacheslav Mashenko. I'm sorry if I've butchered that. So what you get is a photo gallery, manifestly beautiful, of snails and the kind of magical things they get up to with fungi and berries. More cosmic, exoplanet with gigantic rings 200 times bigger than Saturn's discovered, along with a sort of artist's impression of what it might look like. So there's clearly awe here. There's clearly a kind of love. I mean, it's in the name of the page. And in both cases, there's some kind of connection with scientific research. But what's loved in the post doesn't seem to really be the science itself or a particular scientific result. Rather, the issue is, or you could put the complaint in this way: you don't love science, you love nature. And the problem here is that if we let the awe we experience from nature attach to a slightly different object, namely the current result of science or the activity of science as it's presently constituted, there's a sort of shift of our kind of awe from its proper object. It's a kind of idolatry worry. And that's exactly what Peirce ends up saying when he defends the idea that the scientists ought to love reality. He's worried about idolatry. So I'm going to use a kind of slightly obscure bit from Peirce's manuscripts to make this point here. So now the Hieros Buddhist had an imperative need of finding in nature an object to love. His science cannot subsist without it. For science to him must be worship in order not to fall down before the feet of some idol of human workmanship. So this gives a bit of a flavor of both the joys and frustrations of kind of reading late Peirce. Peirce loved neologisms, and here Hieros Buddhist is not one of his terms that stuck. So here the term has some kind of etymological relationship with the word eureka, and Peirce uses it, Hierospud or Hieros Buddhist, as a term for science that is directed to inquiry for its own sake, or directed to discovering the truth just in order to discover the truth. So let's unpack this idea a little bit. Why I think love of reality is important for theoretical science. Well, one aspect of love that Peirce continually returns to is the idea of sacrifice. So love is something that enables you to sacrifice for the thing that you love, for the beloved. Now, theoretical inquiry, Hurospood, if you like, is inquiry for the sake of truth. It has truth as its ultimate aim, but this requires sacrifice exactly because it might require you to forego individual purposes, career advancement potentially, potential commercial applications of taking this line of research versus another, or even kind of having some humanitarian or sort of high kind of ethical purpose in mind in your research. It's a sacrifice to set aside those things. And Peirce thinks it's a sacrifice that's motivated by a kind of love of reality. Now, this last point in particular about kind of humanitarian purposes, I think is maybe something that would come up in the questions, because we are in dangerous waters here, and there are ways that Peirce's thought could go wrong, and I think it does at some points when he's trying to articulate it. But we'll set that aside. What we're doing is sacrificing things that are valuable in order to go directly for or pursue the truth for its own sake. Now, Peirce also talks about love of inquiry. So I complained about you don't love science, you love nature. But there is a kind of love of inquiry. So this is the second love that I want to talk about. And more precisely, it's love of the community of inquiry. So I'm going to give you another block of text that I don't expect you to read all of. I'll highlight 2 bits of it. So he has a famous, for Peirce, set of articles in the Popular Science Monthly, where he makes some really striking claims about the role of the community in science. So the first thing is logicality inexorably requires that our interests should not be limited. They must not stop at our own fate, but must embrace the whole community. So he makes logic or reasoning depend somehow, in a way that we'll talk about, on the community. And the second thing is just to highlight just how kind of New Testament this language is. He who would not sacrifice his own soul to save the whole world is, as it seems to me, illogical in all his inferences collectively. And indeed, he goes on later in this article to say that sort of the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love are the kind of dispositions of the heart that you require in order to inquire well. So let's unpack this one a little bit more. So Peirce is claiming that scientific inquiry is not possible without a community. And I think that's actually a very intuitive, it's a commonplace to say we entirely depend on the previous research that we're taking up, and that our research, ideally, if things go well, will be taken up by future researchers. The slightly odd way that Peirce does this, and Peirce's contribution that I want to put before you, is that for him, even kind of the meaning of the concept of truth depends on the idea of a community of inquiry. So Peirce wants to articulate truth as that which we, the community, would converge on if inquiry were to proceed sufficiently far. Here, advancing this project requires love of our fellow inquirers exactly in this sort of self-sacrifice kind of way. Peirce often, uses the metaphor of a kind of medieval artisan working on a cathedral, where they're never going to see the cathedral, coming into its sort of full flower. Sorry, that's a slightly weird way to put that. You get the point. So yes, Peirce thinks love of the community of inquiry is vital for even reasoning properly. I wanted to pull out to a bigger theme here. So I think there's a really interesting thing that happens here when we think of science as a kind of religious vocation, and how that relates to thinking of science as a profession. So a large part of my current work is directed to improving kind of reproducibility and the quality of data sharing and code sharing. And so here, really the thought is about improving the function of the community of inquiry. We're trying to sort of respond to both the sort of reproducibility crisis that you may have heard of, but also kind of the new opportunities that kind of the explosion of computational power and access to data provide for us. But there's not a chance of me starting a workshop on open science by declaring my love to the researchers that are with me there. And I'm not going to present our problem as a problem of kind of organizing worship, right? I'm much more likely to adopt the language of kind of professional standards if I were to pick between the two. But when I adopt that language, I'm taking it for granted that the people I'm talking to are also motivated by something like a love for reality or like love for the community of inquiry. And I think without having that assumption, I wouldn't even bother with the language of professional standards. It would be sort of, you'd wonder what the whole point was even at all. So that's just a kind of theme that I think it's worth taking away. The sort of Peirce is here presenting science as a kind of religious vocation. And what does that mean for us? Back to these four loves that I am talking about. So the third one here is love of ideas. And here I want to pick out two passages from a text that I commend to you called Evolutionary Love, written in 1893. So if it's the one bit of Peirce you read, I think that's a pretty good place to look. It is not by dealing out cold justice to the circle of my ideas that I can make them grow, but by cherishing and tending them as I would the flowers in my garden. The philosophy that we draw from John's Gospel is that this is the way mind develops. So here I'm going to highlight two things again. So here, love is explicitly connected to growth in addition to mere sacrifice. So if you just harp on sacrifice too much, it can start to sound like you're just a glutton for punishment or whatever. It's sacrifice in order to produce growth. And second, there's a clear, again, link to kind of biblical material, which I won't articulate any further here because I'm slightly slower than I anticipated. So what's going on here? Should we be a bit worried? Isn't science about severe testing of hypotheses? Won't love get in the way? And you can indeed find kind of extreme passages in Peirce in that direction as well. But in evolutionary love, I think testing is thought of as a kind of opportunity to improve an idea. And indeed, I think this is an idea that's more true to actual scientific practice than the kind of heroic picture of the scientist kind of falsifying this hypothesis and falsifying that hypothesis. When something doesn't work, usually you have a good reason to modify it rather than throw it away, as many philosophers of scientists have said following Popper, who's most well known for that kind of heroic image of the scientist. Still, we could read this as kind of encouraging a kind of weird kind of subjectivism or individual bias. And I think that would be a mistake because for Peirce, ideas aren't merely individual. They're not things that just sit inside my head. They're kind of communal property. It's just that I have a relationship with certain ideas and are thereby kind of responsible for their improvement. So how do we get rid of bad ideas on this model? Well, here you're just pointing basically to this idea of growth. And there's an idea in the back of Peirce's mind that, oh, sorry, that's not a good way to put it. There's this idea in Peirce that what we're really doing here is in growing an idea, it's not merely changing it, it's sort of bringing it into harmony with reality. And there's difficult questions here about when an idea has changed so much that it is no longer the same idea, whatever. But that's the same issue that you get with the very idea of like a person, say. But yes, Peirce thinks loving our ideas and growing them is an important feature of inquiry. And the final sort of notion of love that I want to pull out here is the idea of love as a power or love as an agency. And this is where we get a sense of what Peirce means by love more fully. So this is also from the article Evolutionary Love. The movement of love is circular, at one and the same impulse, projecting creations into independency and drawing them into harmony. This seems complicated when stated so, but it is fully summed up in the simple formula we call the golden rule. This does not, of course, say do everything possible to gratify the egoistic impulses of the other, but it says sacrifice your own perfection to the perfection of your neighbor. So again, we have sacrifice as a theme, but there's more to it. Love is both a differentiating force, projecting creations into independency, and a harmonizing force, sort of bringing them into harmony, as you see. So the idea is that love isn't something that creates a kind of bland uniformity, but it finds and grows that which is unique and the thing that's loved. and at the same time, yeah, it finds a place for what's unique about a thing within the wider world. So this is connected with science for Peirce in a few ways. At the very minimum, Peirce claims that love is a useful explanatory concept. For instance, by saying that sort of social scientific accounts of human beings as essentially selfish sort of fall apart because of lacking a certain kind of explanatory resource. But more fundamentally, in evolutionary love, Peirce defends the view that a love of this sort is the power responsible for creation, understood as a kind of ongoing activity, and identifies that creative love with God. Now, the most obvious kind of local resonance with this kind of circular account of love is, of course, the koru, in which we see a kind of diversity of parts growing within an overall spiral kind of pattern. So perhaps it would be better to say the movement of love is sort of spiraled rather than circular. Te Aku Karamu, Charles Royal describes the koru in his Te Ara article on Māori creation traditions in this way. Its circular shape conveys the idea of perpetual movement, and its inward coil suggests a return to the point of origin. So the koru therefore symbolizes the way in which life both changes and stays the same. So we've got growth and harmony on Peirce's side, perpetual motion and return to the point of origin on this description of the symbolism of the koru. Now, I'm not claiming they're the same idea, but I think that's sort of an interesting connection that it would be good to see further explored. So the final section and what I'm going to talk about today. And here I want to connect love, science, and in particular, kind of theism or belief in God. So what is theism for Peirce? We've already seen that he identifies love in some respect as the creator, and love with a kind of evolutionary process of growth. Now, Peirce takes it that a lover has in some sense a mind, so God is in some difficult to specify way mind-like. And indeed, here's a claim that I will make that we don't have time to flesh out, but for Peirce, reason is love in its intellectual dimension. So what reason is the love of ideas, drawing them into harmony with one another, testing them, and so on. Reason is what love looks like when you're dealing with ideas, is the idea here. So on the intellectual level, theism can function as a kind of explanation for the success of science. We can understand the world with our minds because it was created by a mind. This is kind of well-trodden kind of apologetic kind of material, but in Peirce, I think it comes out in a quite interesting way. And so in understanding reality, our reason is kind of following the pattern of God's reason. So that's on the intellectual level. But there's a more kind of affective side as well. So Peirce will talk about coming to know creation as a process whereby you come to know something like a personality. And you come to be influenced by a personality in the same way that you are influenced by, say, knowing a friend for a long time. So when Peirce considers the question of whether there is a God, what he says is the only answer to this question, now the only guide to the answer of this question, lies in the power of the passion of love, which more or less overmasters every agnostic scientist and everybody who seriously and deeply considers the universe. Now, that latter kind of empirical claim is, we can quibble with, but the question here is whether in engaging with reality and reflecting on reality in toto as a whole, one seems to be coming into contact with a loving person. And this isn't, Peirce thinks, primarily a matter of philosophical argument. He thinks the argument gets you somewhere. It's not that he dislikes argument, but what it gets you isn't necessarily living religious faith. So if that's the case, why does Peirce think that most scientists are theists? I don't think his answer here is particularly satisfactory, but it is provocative and sort of interesting. So Peirce understands belief, and this is a feature of pragmatism, in terms of patterns of action. And because of that, what you think you believe and what you really believe can come apart from one another. And so for Peirce, a scientist who's filled with awe towards and love for reality is acting as though reality is created by something like Peirce's God. That's kind of the fundamental aspect of this. You can sort of tidy it up in various ways. But then he's left with the problem of why so many scientists think they're atheists. And for Peirce, he thinks that scientists have a kind of professional issue, which is a tendency to want a precise hypothesis, and that this tendency of mind can fail in certain domains, and this is one of them. So for Peirce, they preside the concept, namely render precise the conception of God, and in so doing, invariably, or inevitably, I should say, change it. And so here the thought is that we can defend theism as a vague belief without having to defend an incredibly specific view of exactly what God is and exactly how God interacts with the world. So Peirce's Christianity, and I'm drawing to a close here, comes down to the claim that love is the creative power behind reality, and that this love is dynamic and evolutionary, so that creation is not, and perhaps never will be, finished. This belief, Peirce thinks, harmonizes with the affective dispositions which underlie the laboratory orientation. So for Peirce, science is a kind of worship. It's a religious vocation. It's not the only religious vocation. Peirce often talks as though, Peirce, I think, clearly believes it's the best religious orientation. We don't have to think that, but it is one way to get involved in the ongoing act of creation. Now, as I've just been kind of articulating, Peirce would be quick to admit that the kind of consideration I'm presenting here is not really a kind of philosophical argument. So what Peirce is inviting us to is to look at our experience in the laboratory, and also the kind of apparent results of science, and see whether this idea that reality is created by and upheld by an ongoing act of love kind of emerges for us. Now, this kind of works for me, but it didn't work for my Peircean PhD supervisor. He reads the same stuff, tries the same kind of meditative kind of experiments, which Peirce encourages, and doesn't find this. So it's not necessarily going to work for everyone. And Peirce says some silly things at times where he suggests that an atheist is, in a sense, like kind of has a kind of defective disposition that isn't really in tune with reality. But we don't have to follow him in that kind of thought. I also wanted, so I think nonetheless, in a context in which you wouldn't be surprised if you turned on the radio and heard someone say, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. I think these kind of views like Peirce's are an appealing one to bring out more clearly. And I think it's also not removed totally from kind of contemporary projects. So one link I'd like to draw is that the kind of project that, say, the priest and theologian Sarah Coakley carries out. There's a book called Science, Games, and God. It's the product of this interdisciplinary collaboration with a series of evolutionary biologists, philosophers, theologians. It's an example of the kind of project which I think Peirce would really like, which is to use science to open up the space for seeing love, in her case, cooperation, and also interestingly, sacrifice, as a kind of evolutionary agency which invites, without enforcing an effective response, that looks something like Peirce's theism. But sketching that connection would be an entirely different kind of talk. So what have I told you about? Gave you a bit of who's Charles Peirce, who am I? 4 connections or 4 ideas about love: love of reality, love of the community of inquiry, without which knowledge is impossible, love of ideas as a condition for their growth, and love as an agency in both human life and in creation. And then I've talked a bit about how love, science, and theism sort of connect together. And I'll just close, sorry, I missed those 2 points. I'll just close with a short prayer from one of Peirce's manuscripts, which touches on the themes of this talk. So we get Peirce saying, "O creator out of blank nothing of this universe, whose immense reality, sublimity, and beauty so little thrills me as it should, inspire me with an earnest desire to make this chapter useful to my brethren." With a few adjustments, I think you can make this into a nice prayer before work for any kind of researcher. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing these slides.
Thank you so much, Joshua, that you certainly did deliver on what you said you were going to. That was wonderful. So questions. You can either put your yellow hand up or you can write your questions in the chat, whichever you prefer. They take a little while to think about their questions. You know.
Yeah. I'll just say thank you for giving me the opportunity to do a bit of Peirce and philosophy, which it's not really my day job these days, but it's good to get back to it.
That's wonderful. Yes. I encountered Peirce in Andrew Robinson's God and the World of Signs, which was a wonderful book as well. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I do have a little list of sort of recommended readings, which I could maybe send to you.
Yes, wonderful. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Antonios.
He's a really fascinating person, and thank you. I've never seen that side of him, the religious side. I just, a very sort of quick question. You were talking about love of ideas. Was Peirce a realist, like metaphysically, about ideas? Did he think that ideas exist even if there are no brains to hold them?
Yeah. Peirce, in fact, thinks that nominalism is the sort of disease infecting all modern philosophy apart from his own. So he's very keen. He was part of why this idea that he sort of opposes seminary philosophy is kind of silly. He was one of the few people in his milieu that was actually reading medieval metaphysics and logic. And he comes to think that being a metaphysical realist is a sort of essential move for understanding modern science as well. So ideas are not just in brains, and they're not. An idea is not. It's not. So he thinks of ideas really as, in a sense, kind of habits that are active in the world, where any habit goes beyond all of the possible cases that might instance it. So you couldn't fill out the meaning of a general idea by pointing to instantiations of that idea. Yeah.
A quick follow-up. Does he make any connection with, Christ as the logos of the universe, ideas, and Christ as the capital I idea in a sense?
Well, he certainly takes himself to be articulating the prologue of John in John's Gospel and what he's doing in evolutionary love. So he clearly thinks there's a connection there, and he's very interested in the idea of incarnation. It's always unclear to me exactly how kind of orthodox he is in terms of his Christianity. And I think more orthodox than most interpreters think, but possibly not entirely. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Richard, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Joshua. That was fascinating. It seems to me that from what you were saying, that Peirce was talking about a reductionist approach to science. That is, he's asking for causes, which is fine. A lot of science still does that, but not all science does. Sort of science I'm involved in, and many others, is more integrative. It's about looking for relationships between different aspects of life, rather than what are the causes. And the purpose of that is not necessarily to discover something new, but to guide policy. I think, for example, in the climate science, people are trying to say, what is the relationship, say, carbon dioxide and methane to freak weather events, if any? That's a very fraught, and I think I know the answer to that. I think pretty clear, but it is still being debated, and the answers are really important, as you know, because of the climate crisis we're in. And we've got to really know whether that is correct or not. If that's not correct, we should not bother with anything like renewable energy. We should just simply keep on doing what we're doing. So that's a very important policy question. And there are many others which I consider are scientific because they use scientific methods of mathematical modeling, which you're familiar with also. So I'm wondering how Peirce's theory, developed over 120 years ago, would apply to that sort of science. I'd be very interested to know how you think about that.
Yeah. There's quite a few points there. I think one of the things that's motivating what he's saying is a desire to defend inquiry for inquiry's sake. And he goes over the top rhetorically, I think, in trying to defend that against the view that science has to be directed to kind of policy changes or whatever. He often will distinguish between, say, pure theoretical science and sort of other things which are also science and carried out by scientists, which are directed to discovering the truth in order to do something else. That doesn't touch on your causal aspect. Now, I think the other thing is that Peirce thinks that the application of scientific results and the decision whether a debate has gone on long enough or it hasn't requires skills in addition to the skills of the scientists. There's sort of a kind of practical nous behind that as well. So that's two aspects of the question. I haven't touched on your issue of causation and reduction. And I think I missed something that you said there about a kind of science that looks at relationships. Is that right? Or sorry to have missed it. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
Richard,
there we go.
you are...
Yes.
So I'm talking about the science of relationship between various parameters, trying to see if things connect with each other rather than saying what is the cause of A, B, or C.
Right. Yeah. I don't think Peirce is committed to thinking of science as a kind of just an attempt to look for causes. So I'm sorry if I suggested that. Certainly he's writing at a time when the idea of kind of a reduction of various sciences to sort of laws is still appealing. So he's got that in mind, but there's no reason why he should have to think that science is just looking for causes. Now, when you talk about relationships between parameters, I mean, it seems to me that still falls within the broader aspect of discovery, but perhaps I'm wrong there or missing something. I mean, are they really those parameters related?
Yeah, I guess there's discovery aspect of that as well, but it's designed to inform policy,
right,
rather than to ask what is the cause of A, B, or C.
Yeah. So I think Peirce would be unhappy if that were the only kind of science that was done, but I think we should all be incredibly grateful that it is being done, and perhaps our ongoing future may depend on it.
Yes, I know the experience of discovering something new. It's very exciting. Something pops up. Should have been there, and there it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
I've been there.
Yes.
In the first half of my career, but the second half of my career has been much more about relationships within the scientific framework. So I think they're certainly both important. I'm just interested to hear how you would fit them all together.
And it's all I do really as well in my sort of actual day job.
Sure, yeah. I understand. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Joshua, I thought there were all sorts of echoes of Jonathan Edwards in what you were saying about Peirce. Do you know whether he was influenced by it?
I am not the person to ask about that, I'm afraid. I know that there are books. There's a book called Churchmen and Philosophers, which is about the more broad history of American philosophy. And that includes Peirce and the pragmatists. And the author of that book, is wanting to draw a connection with Jonathan Edwards. don't know which, certainly on the metaphysical side, Peirce has some sympathy with the philosophy of Berkeley, which I know is supposed to be kind of similar to the metaphysics that Jonathan Edwards produces, but that's as far as I can go, I'm afraid. Sorry.
That's fine. Yeah. No, it was just the idea of love as that I was picking up on. Yeah. So he's really different from Rorty than the other pragmatist.
Yeah, and I think this is an idea that I would need to actually put some more labor into fleshing out. But my inclination is to think that Rorty is just what Peirce would look like without theism, because he's still got all the community aspect, but it's divorced from this view that practice is carried out in a world which is, in a sense, friendly to reason, if that makes sense.
Yep. Seeing nobody else has got a question, I'll ask another one. The contemporary university is not doing really well on ideas for their own sakes, or what do you think Peirce would think about, the demise of the arts and the philosophy and all those sorts of disciplines?
Well, he didn't think the universities of his time were particularly appealing in that respect either. So you can get a sense of maybe the kind of things he would say. He was particularly concerned with, the function of, well, he thought that the function of the function of teaching and the function of research are quite different. And if you have a particular mold of person that you want to produce, and you go ahead and do that, that's not really helping research. And in fact, it's kind of has the opposite orientation, because it's like, I've got this idea and I'm going to stamp it on the world. So there he's thinking of kind of universities as kind of ways to produce kind of elite gentlemen, which obviously Harvard was at the time. In our context, I'm sure Peirce would be worried about language, in particular, about that's come up in some of this recent discussion of the panel that's going to advise on the future of the university. Now, I don't want to make any big criticism of this, because I don't know the details, but one theme that you get sort of linguistically is what is science doing for New Zealand? And that's an important consideration, but it's not the primary consideration. And so there's a need to be able to articulate the value of the arts, the value of the humanities, the value of pure research, all of which are kind of under threat everywhere, in a way that doesn't just reduce them to, oh, and this stuff happens to churn out like useful things occasionally if you just let people do their thing. I do wonder how well you can articulate. So say, I don't like sort of positions that just look with like rose-tinted glasses on sort of the Middle Ages or whatever. But like in a situation in which sort of a large proportion of people think, say, the act of worship is a particularly useful thing to be doing, the idea of comparing research to worship kind of works. And then you've got a kind of a language for talking about kind of pure research. Then perhaps, I don't know what performs that function, absent some more thick kind of worldview, but that's just an open question, I suppose.
Interesting. Thank you. Other questions? I think everyone is thinking still. Yes.
Yeah,
Do you talk to scientists about this? Do you ask them whether they're doing
not much? No, and I think I should a bit more. But yeah, I mean, Peirce, in the course of this, I repeated some claims that are ultimately empirical that I'm sure, given a few weeks, you could get a good handle on sort of the kind of demographics and do some surveys and whatnot. But yeah, as I suggested in my that little cutaway about kind of professional standards, it's not really a kind of language that I go for. But you see it in people's actions.
Yeah. So if you ask them, they might say no, but underneath there really is probably the love there. I mean, the other person your talk reminded me of is Polanyi, who also insisted that community and that commitment and truth and beauty are, what's really, and passion are behind science, more than just objective knowledge.
Yeah. So I think these are all, philosophers, theologians who are also very active scientists who I think, see this connection quite clearly. I don't know. I was considering whether to sort of go off on a tangent about sort of what risks there might be in some of the things Peirce says, but I think, there's no point in me kind of going off the cuff.
You can tell us a few risks. Yeah.
No. Well, there is a definite streak of elitism that runs through Peirce's discussion of this stuff. And it is an open question how well you can do this kind of thing without falling afoul of that. And it's a worry that I have when, you sometimes catch yourself if you've really been in this sort of thought world too long, like thinking kind of elitist. Well, that's crazy. But and I think so the other theme has already actually come up in one of the questions before about sort of important applications of science. So there is room for that on this picture. But you wouldn't know it if you read some of the things Peirce says, particularly when he's grumpy. There's a book called Reasoning and the Logic of Things, which is a collection of lectures that he gave towards the end when his friends were organizing lecture series for him to get him a bit of money. And just before this first lecture series, and again at Harvard, this lecture series was, he's told by the organizer that rather than talking about his discoveries in logic, he should think of a few disconnected ideas of vital importance, so importance to life, to convey to the students. And so the first lecture is just, he's furious. He just says incredibly intemperate things, I think. But the underlying ideas, when you strip away those layers, I think are really good.
Absolutely. And evolutionary love, is that available for people to?
I mean, it's on JSTOR in the original version, and I'll send you
a link,
a sort of reading list link as well. But it's it's in the public domain by now, so you can see that. And it's the end of a series of articles that are very much of their time. He's got articles on sort of protoplasm and various other kinds of things that were very cutting edge in the last decade of the 19th century. So it's interesting in those historical terms, but it's also very moving in places as well.
Well, thank you so much. That was just really fascinating, and I'm sure that people will go away and dwell on it as well, and perhaps read him. That would be even better. So thank you for something really different from what we mostly have, and very enlightening. And thank you so much for staying at work in the cold of the air. That's good. Okay,
cool. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming, and we'll see you all next week.